right, yay. So we get to continue to look at Esther. And I love that we're breaking down the different chapters because isolated as just a chapter, you can really kind of go a lot of different places with each chapter. And so it's fun because I don't know how much we're going to look at the full storyline tonight, as we are just going to look at what I felt like God was highlighting to me when I was reading this chapter over and over and over and over and then over and over again. Yeah. So I'm going to start, I'll jump off by reading the chapter, and then I'm going to kind of look at different little sections of it, and we'll go from there. So, beginning. That night, the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendants replied, "Nothing has been done for him." "Who is that in the outer court?" the king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. So the attendants replied to the king, "Haman is out in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, "What should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me?" Haman thought to himself, "Whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" So he replied, "If the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse, and the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robe and led through the city square on the king's horses. Have the officials shout out as they go, 'This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor.'" "Excellent," the king said to Haman. "Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested." So Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home dejected and completely humiliated. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends what had happened, his wise advisors and his wife said, "Since Mordecai, the man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him." And while they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. So I have it up here, but I figured it would be easier if I read it on here. But that's what you all just read. So, hold on. Pretend like you didn't see that. So I want to look at this chapter. We're going to look at this chapter tonight in the lens with which God highlighted to me, and for this chapter. And it's that the motivation of your heart dictates everything. And we're going to look at this whole chapter through a lens of motivation. So I want to break down this first section to you a little bit. We're going to dive into this here. All right, so that night the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs that had plotted to kill the king. So here's a few things. Timeline, that night. Do you remember what happened in the chapter before? If you don't, I will remind you. They had just had a banquet with Esther. Him and Mordecai, just the three of them, had a banquet. And leaving from that banquet is now this chapter, that night. So you think back to the timeline a little bit. So he was sitting on his throne. Esther happened to put on her brave pants and walk in, and he's like, cool, come in. And he's like, can I give you anything? Do you need anything? And she's like, hey, come and have dinner with me. So they have dinner, and at this dinner, he's like, okay, what do you want? What can I get for you? She's like, well, really, can we do this again tomorrow? And then I'll tell you. And then that's where we leave it. And so he is at night thinking in his bed, like, what, like, what is he thinking? The king was having trouble sleeping. So is he sitting there thinking, like, what does she want? What can I give to her? What does she need? What's going on? I'm going to go back so you guys can have, that's really where we're talking. But, you just begin to think, like, he's saying he's having trouble sleeping. And think about us. Like, if you do a quick Google search, you will find out that 1 in 3 adults don't get enough sleep. And that's not even digging very hard, like, it's right there. So not sleeping is an issue. It's something that we face it's a huge deal. And there's all kinds of reasons why we don't sleep, right? It could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be what we've seen time and time again in this book is God ordained. It can be something where God's bumping into a situation because he's orchestrating something that's going to happen. And I really believe that, again, that's what we're looking at in this book, is that, there could have been practical reasons why the king was laying in bed or not able to sleep. We can think about that. We can think about tons of reasons. Like, this favored concubine, now wife of his, has this question, but it's so big of a deal that she doesn't want to ask him yet. So is he like, did I do something wrong? Does she not like me? Or is he more like, why won't she get to the point? Or is he thinking about something in the kingdom that has nothing to do with the story? You know what I mean? But there's all these reasons why, for whatever reason, he couldn't sleep. So then he orders his attendant to bring the book of history of his reign, or in other passages, it's records of the chronicles of his life. And then I kind of laugh because I'm like, here we go again, like self-centered King Xerxes, like, tell me all about myself. It'll maybe read me the story of my life, and he has parties for months and months just for him, and then now he's like, read me a story about myself. It's like, but I was looking into this whole like record of his reign chronicle book thing, and if you look at it, the book of Esther starts, and he's been king for 3 years at the point that the book starts. Then you have the whole time frame of Esther being prepared and then being married and all that, and so we're a good 4 years into his reign, maybe more, because time's not specific in this book. But so you have this person that's writing down everything that he's doing, and he's laying in bed and he's like, I can't sleep, bring me the book. And the attendant happens to bring the section of his life that just happens to hold this story. Like, it's so beyond coincidence that it's, again, like looking at that God orchestrated moments, things that seem so trivial and so unconnected end up being very connected. Yeah. So in those records, they expose the plot of these 2 eunuchs. And I'm going to read that little passage real quick. It's out of chapter 2. It's earlier on in the story. And it says, one day as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at King Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the 2 men were impaled and sharpened on a pole. So now we can revisit that moment of what that was. So then he hears the story, and all of a sudden, good old selfish King Xerxes decides, what reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? Again, weird character twist, and he asks his attendants, and his attendants say nothing's been done for him. Who is it that? And then again, who is that in the outer court? And they're like, oh, it just happens to be Haman, and he just arrived, and they're asking him to. He says, bring him in. So We don't know at what point in the night the king couldn't sleep and he asked for that record to be read, but we know it's in the night. And then we know by chapter 5 that Mordecai's plan was to go in the morning to ask the king to impale. So we do know that it was kind of a lengthy amount of the book chronicle of his life that was read. But the crazy part is that at what point they decided to read, they got to the point of this story, this remembrance of what Mordecai did in the morning, right as Mordecai decided to go to the court to request, Haman went to the court to request Mordecai to be impaled. So talk about crazy God timing. Yeah. There's so many details of this story that show God's hand orchestrating every interaction. And just the fact that he would be at the court right at that time, that the king would consider honoring Mordecai. Obviously, we don't have a picture of what the king's character really was like. We can see little snapshots of that he enjoyed partying, he enjoyed himself, he enjoyed things like what looked good, what felt good. So the fact that he would want to honor someone else does seem off. And so I love that the story of Esther is showing us these moments that aren't talking about, and God interrupted him to do this, and God interrupted him to do that. But it's just laying out this story of things that happened that you just see the hand of God in these moments that we would be like, oh, it's just coincidence. Like, that's a crazy coincidence. No, that's God ordained, God breathed little bumps and interactions of let's let this happen, let's let that happen. So Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor a man? And he goes on to this big old long list of like, oh, it's got to be me. And if it is me, then that means that you need to make me look like you, take me out on the town and have some high person be like, look at me. You know, he's just all about like, I'm the one that has to be honored, so everybody's, and then to his utter disdain, the king says, awesome, go do that for Mordecai. Guys, he was showing up there to talk to the king, to ask the king to impale, like shove a spear through his body till he died. The very man that he just asked to take him out on a horse. So, either at this point you're thinking, gosh, this guy is so thick, or you're thinking, holy moly, poor Haman is just clueless. He's so full of himself, he can't even get out of his own way. And that's what leads us to this. What you focus on invades your reality. So it's funny how what's happening inside of you, what you're focusing on, what your thoughts are, it invades what's happening in your reality. So Haman was so full of himself, like so self-focused, so focused on being praised, on being noticed, on being whatever that was, having those accolades of others, that when the very suggestion happened of something, he couldn't see it past his own self that it had to be him, and then that gut punch comes in, and it's the very man that he hates that is now he has to do the bidding for that. And that really goes to show the focuses in this story. So Haman was self-focused. He was second in command. He had everything he could want, but he let the actions of one man ruin him. His life was really tragic. Like, he had these looked like worldly good things, or even by Haman's own standards, he had everything he wanted. But the fact that one person didn't respond the way that he wanted, that one person didn't live how he expected him to live, he let that ruin him, like take over and consume him. And I just think about how many times does that happen in everyday life with people. You can have a conversation with somebody and they could be so fixated on their own internal monologue and dialogue and processing that they don't even hear what you say, how you say it. Like somebody can be so hurting and so insecure. I mean, I think about like girls in high school. Like girls in high school, okay, really, I guess women, it could be at any stage in life, but in all reality, there are times where you're so thinking about like what's going on inside of you, like I like crazy stuff, like I feel fat, or I feel like, did I do my hair right? Did I do my makeup right? Did I do this? And you have this thought process. And so Lord knows your face does not look good because you're thinking all these terrible thoughts. And then you walk by other girls and they're like, did you see the way that she just looked at me? She hates me, all this, and it's this crazy, like, not even reality that's happening, but it's because what we're so focused on. Or, I mean, take it to the workplace. You could be thinking about all that you do at work. Like, I do a good job. I do my duties. I go above and beyond. Every time they ask me to do something, I get it done. I get it done. I get it done. Oh, and Bob's going to get promoted, not you. And you're like, what? Or they even say, you're doing a good job. I like what you're doing, but I need you to work on this. And then you just think, oh, I need to work on that. I need to work on that. I'm doing a terrible job. It's just all those crazy things that the Bible paints this beautiful picture with Haman, because he's here, he's sitting thinking, he's naming off this list of all the things that are going to happen to him, and it's not him. And that goes into this. So Mordecai was God-focused. And that's the cool part of this aspect of the chapter, is that way back in chapter 2, whatever that time frame was, Mordecai had a job to do, and it was to protect the king, and it was to guard the gates. And he came across a wrongful thing that was being plotted, exposed it, and did it. Didn't do it for recognition, didn't do it because he wanted himself to be praised. He did it because it was the right thing to do. And we can see that he lived by Jewish law, through the very fact that he didn't bow down to Haman, the fact that he was a man of resolve. Like he knew where his place was, he knew what he needed to do, and he did it. And now we see in this moment how God honored him. Like he wasn't comparing himself to everybody else. He was doing what he needed to do, and then in the right time, in the right moment, it got totally highlighted. And now a king who is all about himself now wants to honor him. Now the very man that is plotting to kill his whole entire race brings him around town in the king's robes, on the king's horse, declaring that he's a man to be honored. I mean, come on, that's amazing. It's so cool. I just think about that, and like there's such hope in that, even in that moment, just to you tonight, that what you do gets exposed in the most beautiful way. And so there can be those scary Haman moments where you think things are going one way, or there can be those beautiful Mordecai moments where God will come and honor you in this crazy way of just beauty. And that's that, like what he returned sevenfold, all of those moments. The next one is Esther. And I said that Esther was learning her focus. And I say that because Esther really matures throughout this story. She really has these defining moments where she's choosing which way she's going to go and how she's going to live her life. And I'm not going to touch on this too much because we've looked at it in a lot of other chapters, and that's not really where I felt like God was going with this. But I feel like it's important to say this, to have a moment of saying that Esther was learning her focus. She had those moments where she didn't have to go to the king. She could have stayed in her comfortable place. But just like Mordecai said, if you don't do this, God will still come through, but don't think that you and your family are going to be saved. It will happen a different way. And she had that moment of choosing where she was going to focus, what was going to consume her reality, what was going to invade her reality. And that's just it. That's that point that God wants you to know tonight, is that what you focus on invades your reality. So Haman took the robes, put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate. But Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. That's our next point, is integrity is a flashlight. It shines to all what's happening on the inside. Ephesians 5:13 says, "But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light." Yes, integrity is what you do when nobody's looking, but it very much shines and projects to everyone else to see who you are, what you're all about. And it shows people what's happening inside of you. And that's where we look at Mordecai did the right thing because it was right. He did the right thing because it was his job, and then it got highlighted and he got honored. And Haman got humiliated for what was going on inside of him. And that's our next one, is that Haman demanded praise, and it was fueled by hate. Guys, deception is no joke. You don't know you're deceived when you're deceived. And that's really what's going on with Haman. Like, he can't see past his own nose. He lived a life wanting to see Jews eradicated. He wanted to see Mordecai impaled, and he wanted his name praised by all who heard it. He was deceived. The Bible says a lot of things about pride and about that. And here are some of our examples that stood out of God's view of being prideful. And that's it. 2 Samuel 22:28. "You rescue the humble, but your eyes watch the proud and humiliate them." And then Psalm 18:27 says almost the same thing. "You rescue the humble, but humiliate the proud." Proverbs 14:3. "A fool's proud talk becomes a rod that beats him, but the words of the wise keep them safe." Proverbs 29:3. "Pride ends in humiliation, while humility brings honor." James 4:6. "God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble." And Proverbs 19:3. "People ruin their lives by their own foolishness and then are angry at the Lord." And I really feel like that's such an example. Like, Mordecai was that. He was so consumed by what was happening inside of him that then Haman, I'm so sorry, guys. They're just interchangeable, even though they're not. Can you not see what's happening in my head? Can you just? No. Okay, so Haman and Mordecai are living examples of God's character played out. Haman is pride being humiliated, and Mordecai is a humble man being rescued. Sometimes we need the practical example of how spiritual laws work, and Esther is a great book for that. In life, we don't always hear God directly telling us what to do or how not to do things, but still we live it out. And that's really why Esther is such a great story to look at, because it is that. It's so much more real life than other parts of the Bible, because we're not always having the fire and the cloud and the burning bush and we don't always have that, or Jesus walking among us. Like, we don't have that. And so this book is just such a good example of that. And really, that is, the spiritual laws are being lived out in these two men. Mordecai, a man who was living the Jewish law, and Haman, who was living self-centered. They were their own honor and demise were happening, despite them saying, like, openly any Bible verses. Okay. So when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends that what had happened, his wise advisors and his wife said, "Since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him." While they were still talking, the king's eunuch arrived quickly to take Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. So the very ones who told him to make the poll in chapter 5 now can see that this is not going to work out. they saw what the favor of God looked like in somebody else's life, and they got the message. Yeah. But dang, man, Haman missed it. Just totally missed it. Still, like his own wife and trusted advisors are telling him, this guy it's not going to happen. Your plan's not going to happen. And so when I studied this book, I just kept feeling sorrow for Haman. I was like, this man, he gave into his upbringing. So remember, his bloodline was that of the very opposition of the Jews. Like it was in his DNA. It was his curse, if you will, generational curse. He was like, hook, line, and sinker, I'm going in with it. I'm already predispositioned to hate the Jews, and I'm going to listen to that, and I'm going to continue on in that. And he was given what he wanted, but he turned his focus to himself, and he served his desires, and he just missed it over and over again, and he got ripped off over and over again. You know, what he was sowing, he reaped. And I'm not really disillusioned to how this works. I know it might seem odd that I'm like, oh man, I really feel bad for Haman, but that's really where my heart was at. Like, Haman was evil. He chose evil, and he chose to live in his hate. And so I'm not saying that that's not like that he shouldn't, that what he chose, I feel bad about that. I don't feel bad about that. I just feel like here we have a man that just kept making all the choices for evil. Okay, so sometimes when we read the Bible, we think like Haman was just the bad guy in the story. Like there needed to be a bad guy so that the Jews could win, that they could be rescued, and so that Esther and Mordecai could be the heroes. You know, and we read the Old Testament and we think like, that's just how it rolled in the Old Testament. You know, there was something bad that happened, but then something good came in and went, or it ended bad, but then the next generation, they did good. And we look at all this and we just think that Old Testament stories, somehow God was like a different guy back then. You know, we think that he somehow changed when Jesus saved the price, like paid the price for our sins. We look at Old Testament stories and we just think God was out there and like destroyed people, and that he had to save the Jews, and that like it was like we get lost in that thought process of like the Old Testament is old covenant. So it's like the way things used to be. But what I want to bring to you tonight and like remind us is that God is the same. He has always been the same. He was the very same God that woos you today. The very same God that makes you weak in your knees thinking about how much he loves you and how much he died on the cross. Well, not the died on the cross part, sorry. But how much he is reconciling you. He was that God, even in the Old Testament. He's always been about relationship. And he's always been about connection. Yeah. And I want you to realize that Haman didn't have to be the bad guy. Like, he didn't have to be the one that said yes to his bloodline. He didn't have to be the one that said yes to the pride and to the hate and to the murder. He didn't have to be that guy. Even back then, there were so many signs. There were so many ways that you can see God trying to humble him, trying to show him where he was going was not going to go well. There were signs. He was like, I mean, look at this. He literally got humiliated, and he had a choice to be humbled in that humiliation. And he had choices that he could have made. You can see the hand of God even trying to woo Haman. And I know I just saw this so different when I was looking at this, because the character of God never changes. He wasn't one way in the Old Testament and one way in the New Testament. You know, I feel like we can see in the New Testament because it openly says all the ways that he has redeemed us and restored us and all of that. And that was still available in the Old Testament. They just had to physically sacrifice to get that connection. And here the hand of God was still working to try to show Haman some signs that even his wife saw, but he was still too full of his hate and pride to see that. And so that's my biggest topic, if you will, point, is that God always wants to rescue you. He's in the rescuing business. If you read the Old Testament, you can see again and again and again, God rescues the Jews. God rescues his chosen people. God rescues the Jews. And the cool part is that once Jesus came and died for all of us, we get covered into that chosen people umbrella. And God's desire, his character, his nature is to rescue us, is to give us those opportunities. So yeah, the reality of the story of Esther is that God rescues Mordecai. Like, he honors him, he shows him, he's showing him that God gives him honor, that favor, that he has favor with God and man. So the very man that hates him is parading him around town, telling everyone to honor him. But I want you to, this is us today in real life. And we need to look at this and realize that there are those of us that can give into our bloodline. There's those of us that maybe we're first generation Christians. Maybe we're the first one in our family that are choosing to follow God. Maybe our parents made choices that would genetically incline us to choose sin or to choose things that would try to make us feel better, that are not something that God chose for us. We are people who can be so insecure and want recognition so much that all we see is how people either love us or hate us, and judge every interaction with whether someone pays attention to us or not, and then makes our decisions based off of that. We can be that. We can live that today. That can be who we are today. Haman is not this crazy persona in the Bible. He's a very real person that any of us could be. And that's what I wanted to really highlight tonight, is that God he always wants to rescue you. He gives us opportunity to shift our focus. Proverbs 11:6 says, "The godliness of good people rescues them. The ambition of treacherous people traps them." In Proverbs 11:8, "The godly are rescued from trouble, and it falls on the wicked instead." Proverbs 28:18, "The blameless will be rescued from harm, but the crooked will be suddenly destroyed." So there's these God will rescue you, and it will get put onto the wicked, or he'll rescue you. The godliness of people will rescue them, but ambition of treacherous people traps them. So there's this constant view that you can look at of, am I going to live in the godliness? Am I going to live in God's character of wanting to rescue me? Am I going to live in that, or am I going to realize that the alternate to that is a lot of not cool stuff? There's so many things in the scriptures that show us what the opposite of living in that is. It's being having our own ambition trap us. It's it's having all the trouble fall on us instead. It's being destroyed. It is being humiliated. It's being beat up. It's all of this. There's nothing good that comes from choosing to give into your selfish desires, to give into your self-focus, to give into your hate, and to decide that one person or then one people group, that because, like, if I hate Connie and she's a woman, now I want all women to die. Like, it spreads huge. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be that way. And that's where I'm telling you tonight that God gives opportunity to shift your focus. The story of Esther could have had a different guy in it. That's the reality of real life. Like, yeah, that's what happened, and it's documented that way with those people. But what I'm saying is that it didn't have to be that guy. And I'm telling you that tonight, is that it doesn't have, like, you don't have to go that way, whatever that way is. And that's really what this last one was, is that anyone full of pride does not have to be destroyed. I think it's so easy to vilify anybody, like that bad guy, or that person that does the bad thing, or that evil, and you vilify this person without realizing that at any point we could be that person, or there's always a choice for that person to be rescued. Or that prideful Haman did not have to die, did not have to be ruined, or whoever you want to look at. Instead, it's like we need to not dismiss the fact that we at any point we can be full of pride and be deceived by it. And really to think that pride is an end all. You know, like once you give into pride, you're a goner. I think the Bible like lays that out a lot too, of that here's all the destruction that comes with pride. But there's always that opportunity. Like God is interrupting our lives again and again to show us that there is a way out. And I thought there was a couple cool examples in the Bible of people who ended well. Like I've been reading through the Old Testament, and it's fun, but then it's kind of like a bummer too, because you get into this story about these people and how great they are and how they live this good life, and then at the end it said, but they chose to build idols to the other gods, and God was angry with them. And you're like, no. Or then you say, God had a promise for this person, but then they chose to build idols to other gods, and God's anger. And I'm like, oh my God. It's like, there's just, but that's the reality. I mean, the more that I read the Bible and the more that I look at it through a lens of God's love and through a lens of Him being the same yesterday, today, and forever, and looking that in the Old Testament, His desire was connection, just the same as it is in the New Testament, and that His desire was to eradicate sin, just the same as it is in the New Testament. It just looked different in the Old Testament because there wasn't redemption in the same manner that there is today. So in the Old Testament, to eradicate sin, it was literally wiping out a sinful people and getting rid of all of that. But then, like, God's chosen people, like awesome men that did amazing things and knew God in amazing ways, were like, but I can just be wives with these girls and that'll be cool. Oh, and you want those idols in those temples? Sure, I'll build that. Okay, oh. Then you miss out on God's blessing. And so it's like, the message is always that sin always tries to infiltrate, and it always comes up in a way that doesn't seem like a big deal until it has ruined you. But that God always has a way for you to get out of it. He always has a way to rescue you. And you don't have to be destroyed. You don't have to be ruined completely in that. And so I was going to put the whole story in here, but I wasn't sure how much time I had. So I want to give you guys homework to read Daniel chapter 4, because it's a super fun story. But it's about Nebuchadnezzar. He was super prideful, and God ends up turning him into a donkey, and he like goes out into this field, and like he's literally like an animal out in a field. Grazing. Yes, grazing and all this crazy stuff. And it's what he needed to like get out of his own way to realize how like full of himself he was. And then God brings him back, and he says in Daniel 4:37, Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All his acts are just and true, and he is able to humble the proud. And in 2 Chronicles 32:26, then Hezekiah humbled himself and repented of his pride, as did the people of Jerusalem, so the Lord's anger did not fall on them during Hezekiah's lifetime. That's one of the places in the Old Testament where it ends good. Yes. But I want you guys to realize, like, man alive, I probably say this all the time, but we have a choice. We have a choice that even if you, like, read the signs, allow God to interrupt, allow God to shift your focus, allow him to be him, allow his character to change you, allow that incredibly humiliating moment to be something that shifts your focus, or to see those signs before they even happen. Because, man, what we focus on invades our reality. So allow other people to show you what's going on. Allow other people to come in and be like, hey, man, this guy's a Jew. His plan's you're not gonna defeat him. Maybe you should stop. And then maybe you could be like, oh, really, wife and trusted friends? Maybe I should listen to you. Or whatever that looks like for you. So this was my Rebecca twist on the chapter 6. and just seeing it through a different lens. That motivation makes such a big difference to us. That Haman's motivation was placed on a faulty place. But that pride does that. It's sneaky, man. It's super sneaky. That you can think that you're just looking out for you in the, like, somebody used to look out for me kind of standpoint, when really you're just looking out for you and not allowing anything else to come. So remember that what we focus on invades our reality. And let's focus on God and let him rock our world. And integrity is a flashlight. Let's let our life project to everyone around us who he is. And don't forget that God always wants to rescue you. Yeah. But are you positioned to let him?